Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 20th IRS International Lecture on Society and Space. My name is Matthias Berndt. I'm the acting head of the research area Politics and Planning here at the Leibniz-Institut for Research on Society and Space in Erkner. And I'd like to very warmly welcome Örjan Sjöberg, who is our speaker today. And let me just say a few words introducing Örjan. Örjan Sjöberg is Professor of Economic Geography at the Stockholm School of Economics, and at the same time one of three research directors at the Center of Sustainability Research at the SSE. And while thinking about how to introduce Örjan, it appeared to me that the one thing which I find really characteristic of Örjan is that he really is a person with an impressively broad expertise and specialization in research areas which are not too often brought together. Örjan and I met for the first time at an urban geographers conference specializing on transition countries. But Örjan is also an expert in international economics, globalization, institutional theory, economic development in Asia. He has written new monographs on rural change, on central planning in socialist countries. He deals with matters of migration and climate change. And he has both taught and written about all these subjects and brought them together. So it's a very broad expertise. And also Örjan has done research in a very broad list of countries. I just mentioned a few. It's been in Albania, Cambodia, China, Croatia, Estonia, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Tajikistan, and Vietnam. So Örjan, you're really, I think, one of the persons I've ever met which brings together such a rich and broad expertise, both in terms of fields and research areas. And I should also mention that Örjan has published in highly reputable journals, such as the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, Economic Geography, Environment and Planning, a International Journal of Urban Regional Research, Urban Studies, and many, many others. So it's a very rich, experience-rich economic vita, and we are very glad to have you here. Today, Örjan will speak about explanations in urban studies and bring together business models and debates in urban studies. The title is Explanation in Urban Studies, Comparative Tactics and Business Models of Developers as Inputs to a Globally Inclusive Urban Theory. And we are really looking forward to hearing that. This is how we will proceed. After this short introduction of mine, Örjan will have the floor for about 40-50 minutes. I will then open up the discussion with a few remarks and ideas from my side, on which Örjan, of course, will have the chance to respond. And we will then have 20 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. And I would like to encourage you to already write your questions in the chat, send them to me so that I can collect some questions and maybe group them. And we will then see how we proceed, how many rounds of questions we have. There will also be a chance to unmute you and to make you seen so that you can ask the questions yourself. We just have to see what comes in. The whole event is planned until 12:30. And after that, we will still have 30 minutes for digital networking using a software called Topia. And the idea is to have at least some of the networking experience that is also an important part of conferences and talks, which is hard in virtual space, but enabled using this tool. So we would very much encourage you to stay with us in that virtual room and use the chance to talk, connect, and network. The last thing I have to say is that this lecture will be recorded. And this also applies to your questions. So that much from my side. So Örjan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthias. And with this very, very generous and kind introduction, I will really be seen as a dilettante that I often find myself to be. I do like to do lots of different things, and as a geographer, of course, spreading one's wings across the globe is a natural, should I say, if not a habit, then at least a propensity. However, the most important thing is it's a great privilege being invited to hold a lecture in this series, and I treasure this possibility of soliciting comments on ideas that have been simmering in my mind for quite some time. Yet these ideas have only slowly and somewhat reluctantly become clear to me. The very fact that I've been able to spend this spring at IRS and to put time into preparing this presentation has done much to make the dust settle. So I'd like to think, at least. Therefore, my sincere thanks to Matthias, and also to the head of the IRS, Professor Oliver Ebert, who made this possible, and all the support I've received from staffers and also researchers and PhD students at the IRS. It's been a fantastically nice place, and there's lots of talent around which I've been able to tap into. I should also acknowledge before I start that the work is partly the result of a research project funded by one of the major private research foundations in Sweden, the Marianne Marcus Wallenberg Foundation. But I also owe a great debt to a great many peoples around the way, none of whom should be implicated in what I'm about to say, but have provided me with an impetus to look at these things. This includes Michael Gentili at the University of Oslo, my colleagues at Stockholm, Linn Leopold and Lars Gunnar Mattsson, and Wing Ching Tang at the Hong Kong Baptist University, his emeritus there. And also my friends and acquaintances at the Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg, where Lars Marcus is holds a chair in urban development, and some of his colleagues that have been very helpful in shaping my ideas. This includes Meta Berghaus-Ponte and Evgenia Bobkova. So thanks a lot to all of you, and also to those who have been able to communicate with here at the IRS. Now, the actual matter of my talk, this is what you are to expect. I'll leave the introduction up here for a little while, just simply, or the agenda, simply to allow you to see that there is indeed a structure in what I'm going to say. It might not be equally obvious when I start talking, but there is indeed a structure to it. So I will start from the slight exaggeration that urban theory is struggling to find its feet. The inclination to favor paradigmatic cities has put its mark on the study of one of the most prominent achievements of humankind, that of the urban settlement. As a consequence, the idea of the city has been reduced to such a degree that the huge variation that exists across urban centers is often left out of sight. And this is in parallel to the diversity of the major metropolis itself, which is being lifted forth as not just a source of unsurpassed creativity or superior productivity, but also something that is to be celebrated in its own right. The field of urban studies is replete with such ironies, and it's not the prerogative of high theory alone. As the so-called Los Angeles School of Urbanism has been challenged, also those who object to single cities being wheeled out as paradigmatic cases alleged conveniently to encompass all urban trends everywhere, as Ash Avin and Stephen Graham put it some 45 years ago. It produces quite a few ironies of its own. For while post-colonial and other critics of Eurocentric norms and templates, including those who called for a provincialization of global urbanism, such critique often starts in the global north or offers a very select number of great urban centers in the global south as the counterpoint. Be it Johannesburg or Shanghai, Dubai or Singapore or the likes. It is rarely actually the likes of Dhaka, Lagos or Cairo, true metropolises, if assessed by size alone, that are accorded such prominence. Still less so centers further down the urban hierarchy, or those that sit somewhat uneasily in between the global north and the global south, such as the global east, to use the term minted by Martin Müller. In other words, critics who note that post-colonialism, despite its focus on particularity and subaltern agency, primarily offers the mirror image of exemplary cities of the global north, have a point. Elsewhere, decentering the object of urban studies, as assemblage theorists are wont to do, achieve little headway, and this for the simple reason that expectations, intentionality, and strategizing all fall by the wayside. Thereby, the urban is reduced to exactly that, an assemblage, rather than something under the pressure of constant change within the limits that the built environment, human creativity, and the resources at hand afford. Now, there's little point in extending this list much further. Already in this rather minimalistic form, it betrays an impulse common across most, if not all, frameworks that aspire to explain the urban, to find the archetypal features of urban settlements that allow for a measure of generalization, if not necessarily a universal formula of defining, in the words of Edward Glaser, our greatest innovation. Against that background, one might perhaps be excused for setting sight on initiatives that do aspire to inform urban theory by explicitly identifying those phenomena and processes that define the urban of our time. Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin and their focus on infrastructure and flows belongs here, as does research considering how urban development is financed, for instance, in the work of Jennifer Robinson and her colleagues, and also Michael Stolper and Alan Scott's focus on agglomeration as a foundational concept for the urban, just to mention the perhaps most obvious ones that come to mind. What all of this is all about, therefore, is that we need approaches that are explicit about the phenomenon and processes that define the urban, yet which we, as I would argue, we still fall short. The question I ask, therefore, are the theories that I just mentioned, are they sufficient to advance the case of urban theory as a unified enterprise, yet one that extends beyond the paradigmatic city or its counterpoints as identified by its critics? An urban theory that can accommodate the large metropolis and the small town alike. One that combines the experience of the global south and the global north with that of the global east. Answering that with what might seem to be an obfuscating yes and no, I will go on to explore a way of drilling a bit deeper, one that would at once integrate the above perspectives, yet make them open to a different, and in my view, more productive empirical approach. An approach that retains the possibilities of systematic comparisons that may leverage, but also go beyond the typology of comparative tactics advanced by Jennifer Robinson a little more than half a decade ago. As such, it explicitly turns its back on grand theory, instead settling for a contribution to urban theories of the mid-range. It will allow us to start anywhere, as Robinson suggests we should, but it does not accept that any singularity will do. We need something that goes beyond that. And geographically speaking, anywhere is fine. Indeed, it's a desirable property. But arbitrarily choosing what to focus on is not. At least not if we strive to bridge the gap between universalizing and individualizing or differentiating phenomena and processes that authors from John Stuart Mill's back in the 1840s to Chris Pickman's and in the opening years of the new millennium have highlighted in their discussions of comparative analysis, or indeed, even if we are to do justice to Kevin Ward's relational urban comparisons. Building anew, therefore, this is an attempt at opening the door for an inclusive urban theory, one that can be applied almost anywhere and that serves the purpose of generalizing or explaining variation as the need might be. Or so I would like to think. It will be up to you who listen to this talk to judge if I'm successful in this endeavor. Now, starting from where? In addressing the shortcomings of urban theory and its claims to explain the urban world, it would be natural to engage with grand theory and grand theory alone. Yet, as already noted, this has tended to privilege a small set of paradigmatic cases, the paradigmaticness of which can be and indeed has been questioned. As the alternatives in their celebration of the singular tend to give up on the quest to generate general insight, the question arises how to steer a steady course between the Scylla of anecdotal evidence turned universal truth and the Charybdis of forever being reduced to heaping one case study on the top of the other. Without going into details here and now, I would be happy to do so in the question and answer session to follow. I would venture the suggestion that a steady focus on theories of the middle range, as originally advanced by the sociologist Robert Merton, could be a way forward. Such theory being a process of arriving at and verifying theory, that is, as opposed to being a theory itself, honors, as does grand theory, the idea that theory is a supposition formulated with a view of explaining something, doing so based on principles, assumptions, or observations that are independent of the phenomenon to be explained. Only that, it's careful to identify the domain to which it pertains. Hence, it's not universal by default. As Raymond Boudon puts it in a widely used quote, theory can be thought of as, quote, a set of statements that organize a set of hypotheses and relate them to segregated observations. If found to be valid, it explains, and in other words, consolidates and federates empirical regularities, which on their side would otherwise appear segregated. I should bracket this by also saying that the need for theory is not just one that it allows you to publish, but actually theory serves the very useful purpose of summarizing the knowledge that we believe we have been able to accumulate. So theory has a value in its own right, not just because it's better or considered to be more prestigious or something of that sort. So just to make that clear. Now, the rationale for going down this road is that it may allow us to focus on something that is common to all urban places, is yet likely to differ, and perhaps differ markedly from place to place. Indeed, it is the very existence of such variation that makes it interesting. In order not to miss out on an opportunity to say something of a general nature on the urban, for instance, we also need something that is not just common across all potential observation points, but also of importance to urban change. It is here that attempts such as those who already alluded to, the splintering urbanism of Graham and Marvin, the issue of financing urban change, as in the work of Robinson and her colleagues, or more broadly in the literature of financialization and assetization, or Scott and Stauber's idea of the city as a response to agglomeration processes and the importance of proximity might prove their worth. Now, useful as these are, they're not fully unproblematic starting points. That's true of all three of them. The splintering urbanism approach, for instance, has been criticized for imposing a particular lens trained on infrastructure and utilities. Its ownership and development that might not be globally present, or that reforms invariably, neoliberal as they're made out to be, end up with increasingly discriminatory patterns of provision of indispensable services. The financialization and assetization literature, for its part, tends to leave out the demand side of the equation. True, as per neoliberal policies, we are all accomplices as our pension money is tied to the logic of financialization. But the immediate users of the structures that set on urban plots of land are for the most part invisible. This prioritization of returns from debt financing and the manipulation of exchange values that not least Brett Christophers has made much to make visible, typically leaves out, however, the co-conspirators, those who benefit in a concrete fashion from the availability of residential, office, or retail space. Yes, the financialization literature also brings up the promotion of home ownership, and above all, the mortgages that go with it, but then as part of a financial logic and the financial logic alone. The needs of or benefits of proximity, accessibility, and agglomeration, the factors that perhaps best helps explain why urban places exist in the first place, that undergirds the idea of a steady rise in real estate prices, are rarely to be seen. Which leads us to the third set of ideas that set out to balance the universal with the particular, that of the urban-land nexus. As is the case with the literature on how to finance urban development and the financialization literature that links into this rather practical concern, Scott and Stauber shares the same common denominator, that of real estate, or more precisely land. Like Robinson and associates, such as Fulong Wu, but unlike most of the financialization literature, in application they take production, institutions, and other expressions of the local into account, path dependence being a recurrent theme. Picking up on the latter of these two ideas, therefore, the present paper can be viewed as an attempt to extend the analysis of the common denominator of the two. This is, in a sense, the foundation of the version of Robinson's comparative tactics. More polemically, I would argue, emphasizing financialization may in fact cloud our understanding of how the urban is constituted and why. The latter gets an important answer in the insistence of Scott and Stauber that urban areas arise in response to the imperative of taking advantage of proximity. Cities everywhere, or so they assert, are characterized by agglomeration involving the gravitational pull of people, economic activities, and other relata into interlocking high-density nodal blocks of land use. Just how this happens depends on a host of factors, and variation across context, as employed in the work by Jennifer Robinson and associates, is often key to our ability to understand not only the local and particular, but also the general. Indeed, Scott and Stauber, for their part, focus on two processes that cannot be reduced to issues of economics and, by implication, finance alone. The one is based in a multifaceted circular cumulative dynamics of clustering and sorting, as they say themselves, that is part and parcel of the urbanization that follows from spatial concentration of production. The other focuses on the intersection of location and spatial interaction. Usefully, they identify urban land as a nexus to the latter. This can be thought of as an interacting set of land uses, expressing the ways in which the social and economic activities of the city condense out into a differentiated, polarized, locational mosaic that corresponds to the essential fabric of interurban space, molded to a significant degree by the behavior of firms seeking locations for productions and households seeking living space, unquote. Said to be structured by the market and the price mechanism, it focuses on the ownership of land where proximity on the one hand and any negative externalities as may exist on the other are balanced for optimal effect. The empirical outcome of this is not a given, and what might be optimal for one actor is suboptimal for another. The lack of plasticity of the built environment and the monopoly that control of a central location implies combine to produce private gains for those in control at the expense both of competing activities and possibly that of society. This is not the typical market failure, though, that can be done away with an additional dose of competition a la Ronald Coase, but in fact one where the shortcomings of general equilibrium reasoning devoid of temporal, spatial, and relational dimensions come into the open. Scott and Stolper attribute this to the construction of, quote, the production space of the city where work and employment are concentrated, the social space of the city as manifest in residential neighborhoods, typically differentiated by variables such as income, race, and class, unquote, to which a third can be added, namely the circulation space of the city, which is represented by infrastructures and arterial connections that facilitate inter-urban flows of people, goods, and information. Now, these in various combinations and permutations will contribute to the rich diversity to be observed across and within urban settlements is obvious, yet the existence of such urban land nexus is itself a universal feature and as such worthy of sustained analysis and comparisons. Importantly, it cannot be reduced to the aggregate effects of private decisions alone. Rather, as urban space itself has the character of a common pool resource, the quality of the land being a result of considerations and actions that are both private and public, individual and collective in nature. It is not just an issue of the level of the entire city or a neighborhood, but it extends all the way to the individual plot of land. This is all very well, yet prompts the question if there are systematic differences across settings. Scott, in a recent paper in Urban Studies, suggests that there might well be, depending not least on the mechanisms for the allocation of land. That mechanism will vary across context and hence come in distinctly different forms that cannot be reduced to a simple and coherent capitalist logic. The reason for this is that variation as exists leads to different responses or solutions, and therefore also variation in outcomes on the ground. This is not clearly spelled out. Scott explicitly notes, though, that private ownership of land is not a prerequisite for the idea to be of relevance. Yet an urban theory worth its salt would also need to be able to accommodate different types of economies, including those that rely on administrative or other non-market means. Similarly, one wonders where the individual agent disappears. For while the general thrust is easy to comprehend, the urban land nexus is still the focal point of activities put in motion by real people, by real firms, and not least by a public sector that cannot be reduced to passive onlooker in a setting where city life is inherently politicized, as Scott puts it, and where remedial action or governance is needed to maintain the spatial integrity of the city, to rectify operational failures, and to avert illegitimate attempts to seize specific kinds of benefits. So far, Alan Scott and his colleague Michael Stolper. It is against this background that I'd like to propose a focus on land and the stakeholders that wield some influence on how land is allocated, and indeed why we should bother in the first place. So, enter the business model. Taking a cue from the work of Robinson and her associates, business models are a useful way of assessing business action, also in an urban context. Put simply, this is a plan on how to make money. As such, it is a simple means whereby strategic intentions and operational feasibility can be communicated, as well as a means for the outsider to explore how an entrepreneur or firm intends to turn a profit. Beyond identifying the customer to be targeted, it pinpoints the value that the firm claims it can provide to that customer. Such value creation is typically not for free, however, neither to the entity providing it, nor to the client or customer who is to benefit from it. Costs of providing it needs to be taken into account, to be balanced against the value created, and in very concrete terms, it returns from providing the product or service that the entrepreneur or firm will tap into. Such value capture is a core consideration for any aspiring economic agent in any market. Without it, the idea will not fly, as the venture will not be viable. Business models have figured in the urban studies literature, if not particularly prominently. Also in the financialization literature, it has had found a place. There it has primarily been used for assessing the inspiring entrepreneur's ability to attract the interest of investors. Not least in urban real estate development, funding is indeed essential, characterized by high capital outlays and often considerable time lags, not to speak of long-term time horizons. The need to convince financial institutions or venture capitalists to provide loans or to offer direct investment is crucial in urban development. Alternatively, it appears in discussions on the interest taken by private equity firms and others in acquiring public sector rental housing. In the case of Robinson and her associates, it has been approached as a means for municipalities or local governments to finance necessary or desired investments. It is also a feature of specialist town planning research, in particular as it relates to Britain, where both under previous corporativist and current neoliberal planning regimes, land value capture has been an explicit part of the various incarnations of relevant planning acts. The idea that land value capture has an important role to play has subsequently spread beyond the shores of Britain, and in addition to that, we do have studies that focus on, say, Canada, Israel, Turkey, and Vietnam, and many others besides. Several of these also provide a link to the literature and transit-oriented development, where business models at times appear as a device to either make investments attractive or as a tool allowing planners to funnel resources into common pool projects, ranging from basic infrastructure to various social amenities. Hence, both in their private-public partnership guise and in negotiations between national and local governments, future gains in land values often figure prominently as an inducement. In most of these cases, the focus is indeed one of the core elements of the business model, that of value capture. It is often approached as an issue of taxation, albeit at times indirect, as in the case with planning obligations and similar features. This is not at all surprising, given that windfall gains from rising land values have been debated at least since the time of David Ricardo, 200 years ago, and of course made famous by Henry George in his quest for a land tax. Indeed, it has not quite disappeared from academic and policy debates, and also economists, celebrated economists such as Joseph Stiglitz, had taken an interest in the solutions that Ricardo and George suggested. Really, however, is this discussion structured around the mechanics of the business model, often alluded to, and how value creation is linked to the value capture part. This is an opportunity forgone, for although it's easy to see that it is the potential for rising land values that are at the heart of attention, and that land value is typically thought to be on the rise, hence there is a future stream of rents to tap, it leaves out several of the interesting features that can be leveraged for a deeper understanding of how projects are driven forward. We will return to those land values in a moment, but before we do so, let's take a look at business models as an analytical tool. It revolves around the difference between it revolves around the tools of value creation and value capture. As it does so, it implies or requires that the prospective entrepreneur or investor will be able to lure customers through a unique value proposition, and through that generate a stream of revenue that can be captured. So it revolves around the difference between, on the one hand, the individual customer's perceived utility as regards, as reaped from accessing the product or service, and the price actually paid, as assessed at the point of sale, and the aggregate outcome of all sales across a particular market on the other. The latter, minus cost of various sorts accumulating across the process of creating the value, is the value that firms might capture. Whether it does so in full or not, or whether the value there to be captured is substantial or not, will decide the fate of the firm, or at least of the product that is being on offer. In that sense, value capture is a necessary adjunct to the viability of business ventures, but the latter also critically depend on the ability to create value to customers in the first place. As there is a potential for competition for resources between the two, there's also a need to balance the two activities of value creation and value capture. Although the finer detail of embarking upon such value creation and the equally important step of making sure that value is captured by the entrepreneur or the firm can be left aside for now, it is the stuff of much strategy literature, actually. It is essential to note that they are not just complementary, but also a source of tension. In short, there is a potential trade-off in that the dual set of activities create a pressure to economize on the resources needed to excel in the one or the other. That trade-off is not only decided by the internal resources the organization commands, but is also influenced by the institutional setting within the firm finds itself. In turn, this realization opens up for an assessment of whether venture covers its full cost to society or not. Now, the process of setting up a business model that allows the entrepreneur to reap part of the returns to a successful value proposition may induce us to look at the enablers, the elements that structure the value chain, or above all, the value proposition itself, the revenues created and how values are transferred. We also need to know to whom the value proposition is to be addressed. All of these come in a variety of form, yet it can be summarized in a generic fashion in the form of a business model matrix that not only makes evident the morphology, but also outlines the options, as in the diagram. I just want you to point out a few features here. The first one is, of course, the value proposition, but also the segmentation part, which is essentially to say, now, how do I identify my customers? What group of people or potential customers is it that I want to reach out to? Quite clearly, there are, depending on the product or service, there will be very different groups of people interested. And also the ability to actually effectuate the demand, so think of the resources the customers command, will also be different. And we could think of it that we have no segmentation at all. So we reach out to everyone. We might find a segment in terms of income, social classes, locations, or age groups or whatever. We also find niches, special interest niches, and there might even be atomic segmentation that tries to customize things for the individual to be addressed. Now, in addition to this, there's another thing that I'd like to mention, just for the sake of the argument, as it will evolve later on. And this is the kind of customer benefit that could be accommodated within this framework. Now, you might think that it's pecuniary alone, but actually the benefits range much beyond the monetary value of it. We could have, there could be an interest in the product or service because of functional reasons, what kind of service it brings. It could be for social reasons and also emotional ones, not just economic. I'll ask you to make a mental note of this as we go along. Now, there's another much simpler version of this, and this is known as the business model canvas, one that is actually often communicated to aspiring entrepreneurs and therefore of interest. It can also be added to, I won't do it here, to accommodate, for instance, sustainability concerns in the form of the costs and benefits to society. Also here, the value proposition sits at the center, but so does the customer. And these two come together, and the nature of the relationship and the channels through which they engage are important, but need not detain us at all here. Now, when the customer and the value proposition meets and they match, this will create a revenue stream that would be used to balance the cost of providing that service, the value created part of the value proposition. Now, this is a very simple way of doing it. And you may ask, why would this be relevant to urban development? But what it does is that it does remind us not to forget the prospective user, the one whom the value proposition is advanced. Real estate is made up of land and whatever is constructed on it. And capturing current and future values are an important feature of the value proposition. So it's not just a question of providing some useful service to the customer, it's also a question of how to capture part of that value so as to increase the revenue. But land is a bit peculiar in this sense, in that it might create rents that are not necessarily created by the entrepreneur. It is, after all, something of a collective enterprise. Now, buildings and activities that stand on the land create externalities, the positive ones that Scott and Stolper lived for. But so does infrastructure and other resources created and held in common. And the question is, who is it that funds all of this, and who is it who actually benefits from it? And here, the prospective customer might be one candidate for those gains. And so it's, of course, the entrepreneur offering the service or piece of land or whatever stands on it. And the interesting feature, I think, in all of this is that the externalities are primarily captured in the land rather than on the buildings that stand on that land. Buildings and other opportunities are often the means to access land rights, on the other hand. So buildings And the function that they bring, or the benefits they bring to the customer, is a tool for prying out the gains that are embodied in the land. And that comes both from private and public, individual and collective effort. This tension here is easier to see if we use a business model as a structured way of thinking. And in particular, the importance of the customer in all of this must not be forgotten. Without them, there will be no demand for the services offered, and therefore the opportunities of laying one's hand on the land rents will be limited. Now, as indicated in the literature, for instance, by Jennifer Robertson, Fulon Wu, and others, that the customer may, in a sense, be the municipality or local government. But that's immaterial in this case. It's the generic, general picture on how to think about these things. Now, obviously, if we apply this to the business model thinking to urban development, we will find that land ownership forms will differ across nations and localities, and they might even differ dramatically, even within the short span within the administrative borders of a city. And so will also tenure forms. They will also be very, very different. And all of these will allow for variation that comparative approaches require. It might also end up with a bewildering set of different types of outcomes and settings. But then again, I would argue that it's useful to focus on land, which is always involved. Urban centers do not exist on the head of a pin, but rather have spatial aggression, spatial extension. Now, in addition to that, we also need to recognize that value creation and therefore also the value proposition put to the prospective customer is at least in part a collective pursuit, at least as far as urban development is concerned. Value capture, or perhaps in some kind of more appropriately, value appropriation, is as likely private or individual as collective. It's a question how these tensions between these different potential outcomes, how it works out, some of which might be conditioned by the institutional setup. So the formal rules and the social norms that apply in a given place and time might be an important part of that context within which this tension is played out. What's not equally obvious is that we need to recall that I asked a general theory or some inputs to general theory would need to be able to accommodate different types of societies, different types of economies. And therefore, going back to the morphological matrix that I showed you, it's important to realize that customer benefits need not be pecuniary alone. These benefits can be functional, economic, social, and emotional, some of which, of course, may be translated into monetary values, but many that cannot be summarized in that fashion. Now, this also allows for other objectives to be reflected also in a business model. It doesn't have to be a business model. It's simply a model of how a project is driven forward. So useful to remember that it need not be in pursuit of pecuniary gains and profit. The actual mechanism for land allocation is not the main issue, even though it is, of course, important, just as are tenure forms or ownership forms. But ownership form itself does not decide the entire setting, nor does tenure forms. What matters is really the nature of the contest over the benefits created, specifically how the value created is captured by whom, and by what means. Isn't this a worthy task for comparative urban studies, do you think? Perhaps also, or so I would argue, a more productive way of approaching the urban than the prevailing ones. Above all, it is more inclusive in that it's equally appropriate to the global north, the global south, and the global east, and to urban settlements irrespective of size. It is also possible to apply to the past of the global east, when there was no recycling of land thanks to a secondary market for it, instead that we had other mechanisms that were at work. They could still be analyzed through the lens of a business model, even though the antics of the centrally planned economy might not have been all that businesslike. I'll stop there. My time is up, and I'll thank you a lot for the attention, and I do look forward to receiving questions, queries, and any attempt to try to shoot my argument down, because at this stage, I sorely need that. So thanks a lot.